I'm Jordan Valdina. I'm a registered architect and a professional engineer. Designing spaces and connecting people to places they love is what I do. Using the material in this program, my hope is that I may inspire and provide value to you in your journey through our built environment. This is the Architecture Show.
This episode continued from part 1.
From that perspective, it could be seen as primitive building, vernacular architecture, civilization and empire, and then sort of even greater levels of that, by which all these things started to synthesize, and you see these just amazing mergers between art and painting and sculptural sense and knowledge and materials and structural knowledge and religious ideas, and then ability with wealth and time to create, for example, some of the cathedrals and some of the buildings, for example, or before, but during the Renaissance and forward. So it seemed to be overall trends, and again, a lot more dissemination and style of architecture that's built in Europe, for example, now literally transporting via plans and ideas on a boat to the Northern American continent, for example. And then as the level of industrial complexity, getting finally to the industrial revolution, the means and methods of ability to put these systems together, and also some of the drivers of what is important to the society in a different direction than an overall mythology, just nothing diminutive about it, but culture. Excuse me. Yeah, so right, so during this industrial revolution and coming up to it was kind of like a swell, if you will, and different drivers, now one being this industry in housing. So before that, you know, variously people sought to get the most work out of people, but not via a factory, not via a big construction. The big construction was to glorify the rulers, you know, to glorify the religion. Now you had this element that you know, a driver, a different value system driver, producing something very functionally based to produce wealth and to produce outcomes, whatever somebody's view on that. But that was, you could say, a really secular notion. The history of rulership is actually not so secular. Even though it relates to what we would call secular, it was very merged in the past, generally speaking. This was actually a new component in that sense. It's always been there, but one that now affected architecture, and you started to have these larger functional buildings. What's a precursor? You know, a barn, you know, for example, or some area in which the land is arranged a certain way of buildings for certain practices to take place? Yes, of course. But now you had a new stream, a new level of intensity of that stream affecting the architectural style of certain buildings. And so now you're kind of starts to go off the chain, if you will, of some of the previous predominant vectors of style. And while the basis was still totally functionality, and this is not a linear sequential overview, of course, I'm just kind of broad stroke looking all over, seeing all these trends. The idea of an idea driving a design started to grow. Funny that to say that, because it was always there, right? People were always affected in how they designed and built things based on ideas in their head or convictions and beliefs. But the idea that an idea, okay, so no longer, well, it's within this religious, context exactly. It's as linked to this specific functional, very purposeful thing, driven by trial and error and experience. A little bit something else started to grow and grow and grow. And more common people, if you will, not following the dictates of an authority or directly the mandates of an employer, but more independent merchants and independent thinking started to affect how wide this pathway started to open you get to rethink the building, the design. Not for the king, not for the factory, and not to prove that one had such a mastery of classical design sense to do a variation of it that was just fitting a new place that we had arrived at physically and could now build in that way with our wealth. But I don't know, actually. Let's think. Or wait a minute, let's not think too much. Let's revive. Let's reach out and do a Greek revival. Nothing wrong with that. But that's a revival. Style revival happens regularly, goes in cycles. Look back, grab something, kind of mix it with what's currently happening. And at some point, in fact, wait, let's be something else. Let's be something new. Let's be something modern. Modernist. So, ideas driving style, unlinked, more philosophically, just what if, what does it mean? With a question mark, not go reference an ancient text, a traditional text, a dominant form coming from the ruling class, the government, and notions of tradition. No, it's a question. What does it mean? What should we do? What would be valuable to express? And then sometimes styles, especially after this, would just, the only idea that, that's maybe undercutting it a bit, but one way of looking at it is, anyway, not the only idea. The idea that was come up with was, I don't know, but it's not that. It's other than that. Post. I'm not saying that's what this style is, so much as the label describes it in this way. There's not really a substantially new label, but to say it's after, postmodernist. So now you're getting into this sort of very free, open realm. In any case, a general progression may be seen to have taken place from less to more permanent in the nature of people's buildings. From the so-called primitive to the generally more substantial, that compose the so-called vernacular buildings, from which sprang the, again, so-called vernacular architecture. Yet, drivers of design were not that much different from its primitive precursors in a given region or within a given cultural or religious or mythological or other worldview, the way people lived in that area, how they perceived their world, how they perceived their place in living in it, greater context. Now, I realize the way I've been talking about some of the developments and describing this kind of unchaining and the idea of an idea is actually sometimes, in certain cases, literally diametrically opposed to how people have described the developments in design. Meaning, some of the ornamentation and the gestures to tradition, even if they were an expansion of an idea that people had prehistory, so-called, it was actually not functional. And I said that it was built on fundamentally survivalistic function, and then some kind of, when people had more means at their disposal, started to add layers, but on that same fundamental core. That's true in a sense, that I get it, why that's said. Because, for example, modernism, the idea was actually just to look at function. And yet, it's an unchaining of the context in which one approached design. So, early enough in any case, there was no gesture that wasn't really seen in a sense as functional. Now, what does that word mean, functional? It doesn't mean, as we started with, just shelter, protection, safety, survival, heat or cool or whatever. Actually, the generally speaking, the prehistory is that there is no separation of functional considerations. So there's my survival, but that's not a separate silo from my worldview, my spiritual, mythological, religious, whatever, however that's categorized, total perception of what's important in the world. So gestures built off of that. And And then, well, what about playful gestures? What about high levels of ornamentation? What that wasn't really functional, right? Yes, but it was built out of that paradigm, and then it was pleasing, and it seems like it's a divorce from function. But I just want to take the view that from the perspective of the past and the progression in which it was unfolding, it wasn't viewed as a revolutionary shift. It wasn't viewed as a fundamental break. Yes, in certain cases, somebody could say, it was not okay to ornament that type of building in that way, and then somebody did, right? But that's more like a totality of expression of kind of what was already there as people, right? We love things that bring us pleasure, etc. So certain forms of ornamentation might have been outlawed, and then somebody did it. So it is how you look at it. But even though the professed aim and actual aim, let's say, of modernism and other styles was, no, actually respond directly to the function, which you could say was a returning. But if you look at the forms, the way that was played out, I think that's a little open to debate if it was along the same vector as what was happening. And as I'm, this is something to consider and discuss. As I'm presenting it, it is a market shift, and it did follow on a large scale, not everywhere always. The world is a very big place, right? A lot of things happen in different times in different places. But on the scheme of things, the ability to manipulate materials and means of construction and what we could build with, and the way we were rethinking our world in and around the Industrial Revolution and all the things that were taking place in and around that time, and then a little following, and the new rethinking of design, whether the priority was stated and accurately stated as function, function, function. However, the way that broke with the past, not its stated purpose, but the way it broke with the past is what I'm saying was a crucial, really a fundamental change in the approach to style in architecture. And following from that was experimentation that related to the way of thinking, meaning I'm going to define the basis of the priority of this design as a new thing. Something that I'm going to tell you what it is. And there was no reference necessarily to historical context. There was no reference necessarily to a religious context. There was no reference necessarily to a geographic basis. There might be, but all these things started to be called upon as if it were optional. I'm going to choose different palettes as a designer, etc. So that's what I was trying to get at with the notion of the free, open realm. And where does that leave us now? Well, look around and perhaps you'll see. But there's a lot happening. There's a lot happening relating to means, I would say, more so than fundamentally style. So building automation. That results in a change in the way the building looks and therefore its style, potentially. It can, right? Amazing materials, just high tech. But to me, that's not a revolution from the revolution of designing on the basis of ideas. New ideas off the chain of the past. But rather, now we're in that evolution that, to me, again, what I'm proposing here, fundamentally began in and around and just after the Industrial Revolution. So while we have green building, which results in certain styles, and while we have super high tech, and while we have computerized and automation, there has not yet been a new revolution in approach to style. Now, I'm just going to close out with reiterating, this is one opinion in one view, the major purpose of which is to hopefully inspire you, hopefully encourage you to go look into architectural styles, look into the history of architecture, and see how it's presented. And hopefully by having this view, which maybe is a little different here or there than some of the predominantly held views, that depends on what you'll find, that it will kind of dimensionalize that search and enhance that appreciation. Being able to look at things in different ways, I would suggest is really important. So seeing how it's historically held, for example, a view on style, seeing how it's currently put forth in standard practice, if you will, the categorization of the different styles and how they relate, and then thinking about it a new way. Perhaps some of the ideas I presented here in this episode of the Architecture Show will be such a, that's a different way of looking at it. And then trying to see with no point of reference of a category or a historical context and just directly perceive, if you can, right? Just to appreciate form and function in architecture directly. And then lastly, I suppose, certainly not least, is developing your own views on style and your own assessment and narrative of the history of architecture and the relevance and the interconnection of the styles and the history. So again, I hope it serves you in that way, and enjoy your exploration through the styles and the history that's all around us in our built environment.
Key Life.